Hello, Bill.
Hello, Matt. How are you today?
I'm doing swimmingly. Good to talk to you, as always.
I know that the right has been in soul-searching mode, trying to, we've talked in the past, finding their way on various social issues, and now the big one, gay marriage, front and center at the Supreme Court. How is the right handling having the issue being sort of forced upon them? You're already seeing a lot of senators feel compelled to recalibrate their stances and embrace gay marriage explicitly. Certainly on the Democratic side, also Senator Portman. It's becoming harder and harder to kind of dance around it. So is this going to spark any kind of? And there was Karl Rove's comments over the weekend, which were a little misinterpreted, but still.
Yeah, I thought that was much ado about nothing. He was, Karl. This is a different topic, but Karl Rove was asked by George Stephanopoulos, "Do you think the next Republican nominee will favor, same-sex marriage?" And Rove said, "Yeah, probably. But look, here's the real issue." And he really parried the question, and he didn't bring it up. It was thrust upon him, and he sort of dismissed it. And yet the headlines all over the place was that Karl Rove says the next Republican, I thought that was really misleading.
The comments, the reporting of it was overstated.
Yeah.
But it's still interesting that the guy who was, the puppet master behind all the anti-gay marriage ballot initiatives in 2004 to gin up conservative turnout is now kind of shrugging his shoulders at the whole issue. I mean, that in of itself is.
But I don't think anyone. Yeah, but I don't think anyone ever. No one probably really ever believed that Karl Rove was some sort of a culture warrior. I mean, I think that he did what he did in a sort of Machiavellian sense, and he did what he had to do to win.
Well, right, but even said that the Machiavellian position has shifted so dramatically in 8 years. That is a story. I still don't think it justifies the way that I think they made a big deal out of his statement on this week, which I think was really overblown. It's an obvious attempt to manufacture news and to try to get news. They could have if Stephanopoulos asked that question. If you're willing to manufacture news, there's no way it's not news. I mean, whatever Rove says becomes a headline, and so he sort of. I don't want to overdo how they overdid the news, but it just struck me as a prime example of how our modern media today manufactures news. But to your larger point, Bill, yes, I think you're right about public opinion. I want to keep digressing for a second.
Okay.
Because I think this is part of the reason why I don't watch the Sunday shows anymore. You might not know this, Matt, but when I started LiberalOasis.com, one of my signature features was the Sunday show breakdown. I would watch all the shows Sunday morning, and I would do a post that sort of synthesized everything that happened, and and part of the fun of it was kind of deciphering what the politicians were saying. Try to dispel the code, the Beltway code, so folks at home could really get what it is that they were getting at. And that was sort of what Sunday shows used to be. It used to be much more of here's a window inside of the Washington conversation and a preview of what Washington's going to be working on for the following week. And now it has degraded into just an extension of the cable TV chattering nonsense and trying to get the cheap soundbite that's going to get a lot of clicks the next morning. And it's not providing anywhere close to. I mean, what the Sunday shows used to do was a very distinct thing. It was a public service thing. It was, okay, we get free spectrum from the people, so we're going to have some slot of TV somewhere that's just about current events. It's sort of along the lines of doing the nightly news every day. It wasn't about being as much of a profit center. They started realizing, hey, this is actually cheap programming. We're making money off of this. How can we maximize profits? How can we compete with what's going on cable TV? Let's just get down in the muck. And I as a look, they have every right to do it, but as a result, I don't watch it myself. I do not make a point of watching. I feel like I don't miss anything. When you have some sort of hydro roundtable with Karl Rove and an actress and a pundit, they're just having talking past their conversation. They're not actually providing any value to me. That used to be a fun thing to see Bill Maher do. It's entertaining, perhaps, to some degree, but I don't have to sacrifice my family time on Sunday to watch it because I'm not actually learning anything.
I'd love to add something, Bill, but I think you hit it out of the park. I couldn't agree. I could not agree with you more. I think you are exactly spot on, right?
Thank you. Another
that makes for a boy. See, that shows why this isn't Sunday morning TV, because we could never agree. And I think that the people who watch blogging heads are a more sophisticated, certainly a smaller, more select audience. But you get a real discussion here, and I think part of that is not always disagreeing. I think you're totally right. I got nothing.
So back to the gay marriage question. Does the Supreme Court case is it dragging conservatives even closer to the marriage equality place, or are you starting to hear the Roe v. Wade style of commentary? Hey, slow down, court. You're going to start this giant backlash if you jump in too fast. So leave it to the states. That's where all the action should happen, and the bigoted states can do their thing, and the gay loving states can do their thing, and let's just leave it at that. Is that where the right is going now?
I think a few things are at play here. One, I think that there is a general sense that the larger culture war has been lost, which is interesting, considering it seems premature, but there's just a sense amongst conservatives, a pessimistic, defeatist sense that that's the case. I think that the biggest mistake, but I'll put it to you this way, the thing that advocates for same-sex marriage, the thing that they probably should fear the most is a sweeping Supreme Court decision. Because it seems like the momentum's on their side, and it seems like public opinion is heading their way, and that this could happen very organically and at the ballot box or through representatives. And it may be that the only thing that could, in politics sometimes winning is losing and losing is winning. And so it strikes me that some sort of an overreach by 9 unelected elites could be a turning point if there is to be one. And this may or may not be analogous to Roe versus Wade, but that could give that could be a boost to the conservative cause, I would say. And so I think if you're a defender of, if you're an advocate of same-sex marriage, I think maybe it's counterintuitive, but the smart move may be to root for a very narrow decision. That's my take. I'm sure that people will disagree. Bill, what do you think?
Well, certainly it looks more likely there's going to be a narrow decision based on the questioning, although, as we learned with the Obamacare ruling, the question analysis of the questioning can lead you in wildly wrong directions. They had stuff to have their internal deliberations, and who knows might come up. I don't think anyone expected such a sweeping ruling when they had Lawrence v. Texas, which outlawed anti-gay measures like sodomy bans. And which Kennedy wrote this very sweeping ruling on. No one saw that coming, I don't think. I suspect on the left they're not being too coy about it. They want the whole thing. They believe in the whole thing. They believe that it's just wrong for there to be any kind of discrimination on sexual orientation. The Constitution does not allow for that. and they want to see it, written down on paper. And you don't see a whole lot of regret on the left about Roe v. Wade in the first place. There's a bit of some commentary on the left that Roe v. Wade was poorly reasoned and sparked more of a backlash, and maybe there was a better way, yada, yada, yada. But for the most part, that's still seen as the firewall. No matter how much things get chipped away at elsewhere, no matter how annoying the fight continues to be, you at least have that.
But I would say that politically, Roe versus Wade was tremendously helpful to Republicans. I don't think it's debatable. I mean, to me, the fact that conservatives lost that case was incredibly helpful for at least a generation to Republican candidates.
Well, I mean, it depends on what your perspective is on it. I think
dominating politics for a generation is I mean.
But you could argue, I don't totally accept the premise, but let's just take it as let's take it at face value. I think I would argue there's a clearer argument for backlash after the Civil Rights Act and Brown v. Board, particularly after LBJ and the Civil Rights Act. There was such a backlash after that it split the Democratic Party. The George Wallace Democrats walked. Nixon got in, and that was a transition point towards the broader conservative tribe with Reagan. As unfortunate politically it was for Democrats for a long time after that, you still had the Civil Rights Act, and I think that there were a lot of people on the left that said, we tend to lose a lot anyway, so at least when we're in there, if we get something that sticks, we'll take it, and that's a pretty big something. So I think a lot of folks, who are particularly on the social activist side of things, they don't look at it in terms of what's going to happen in the next election. They want to get what they can get and have it stay in place.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue winning is winning in the long run, and it's about putting points on the board and not worrying about the next election necessarily. I mean, that's a debatable point. So I do think that there are some interesting things happening in this regard. One, I just interviewed Eric Tietzel, who is a 29-year-old pro-traditional marriage activist, one of the young people who was profiled in a very good New York Times piece this past week. And for a long time, I've had the sense that the social conservative, sort of pro-family groups have been asleep at the wheel, not nearly as effective as the fiscal groups like the Club for Growth. And it does seem interesting that there appears to be all of a sudden some very, very smart, competent, young evangelical leaders on the scene pushing back at this issue. I wonder if they're maybe too late. Had they arrived on the scene earlier, and their marketing is pretty cool. These are young people. It used to be, fair or not, it used to be that the impression of social conservatives, and I alluded to this last week when I resisted being labeled a social conservative. I mean, the image used to be a sort of anti-intellectual, religious right, Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell. And I know it's ironic, Falwell ran Liberty University and Pat Robertson had Regent University, but the image was a sort of an unsophisticated image, and there's been a movement in recent years pushed by people, or not pushed, but people like Tim Keller, pastor of Christ Redeemer in New York City, Eric Metaxas, author of Bonhoeffer, and the late Chuck Colson, to kind of provide intellectual heft to the evangelical movement. For a long time, it was really the Catholic movement that amongst kind of conservative Christians that was buttressed by this kind of academic, intellectual force. So that is a change I see happening. It's a good sign for evangelicals. I wonder if it's maybe too late for some of these cultural issues. I have a piece at The Week this week, Bill, and I know you've been writing at The Week. We call this The Week in the Week. I have a piece at The Week magazine that just went up, sort of looking at the philosophical underpinnings of why social conservatives believe the things that they do. You won't be surprised to learn that it's because of they'll search for secular arguments, but it truly comes down to their belief in Judeo-Christian values and the belief that a government ought to be in charge or responsible for advancing virtue in a society. And Bill, here's where there's a huge schism on the right, because classical liberals, which not to be confused with liberals, I mean classical liberals are basically kind of free market, limited government folks. They basically want to be left alone by government. They don't agree that a primary role of government ought to be advancing virtue, or what social conservatives see as virtue. So I won't get too philosophical on us, but if you're interested in that sort of thing, I'm writing about it at The Week, and going to blog about it soon at the Daily Caller too. So check it out.
It seems to me that any kind of last ditch effort to try to save quote unquote traditional marriage to be solely the purview of heterosexuals. I mean, I guess a lot of people always make the "you're on the wrong side of history" kind of arguments, but I feel like there's a distinct difference between gay marriage rights and abortion rights, because you're never going to have a consensus on abortion. It's just a subjective call whether where you believe absolute life begins and when a fetus has same human rights as everybody else, all that kind of stuff. Like that's just a judgment call. There is no science that's going to pinpoint it for you. And different religions have different views on the subject to boot. Whereas with once you see gay couples marrying, and you see them in your communities, and you see them raise kids, and all the kind of boogeyman arguments, you're looking at them in the face, and you see that they don't stack up. Their kids aren't troglodytes. They're just as well adjusted as any other kids in this world. The argument just completely falls apart. And I would think anyone with a cooler head you'd see what's going on in the states that already have equal marriage rights, and nothing's really all that different societal wise. That there isn't some sort of breakdown in society unique to those states that isn't happening in other states. It just seems like sometimes you just got to cut your losses and say maybe deep down you believe in your interpretation of the Bible and it's just not right. But you know what? Lots of things go on in society that the traditional interpretation of the Bible doesn't, laud. And you believe what's in your heart, and you wait for God to pass His judgment when you die, and you go about your business. You don't have to argue it in the annals of Congress and in the courts all the time. So I assume a lot of Republicans are getting to that point.
Well, I think a lot of Republicans and conservatives fundamentally agree with that. Many do. I think social conservatives are on their own here. And it's because they believe that as much as they can search for secular arguments, I mean, fundamentally they believe in I would say a Judeo-Christian worldview. They believe that family is the fundamental building block of society, of culture. Family came first, and then towns, and then the nation state, or whatever, and they believe that it is a role of government, a primary role of government, to preserve virtue as they see it. That differs greatly from how libertarians and classical liberals, meaning fiscal conservatives or shorthand, view, their worldview is entirely different. And so social conservatives are, you talk about God, gays, and guns. Aside from guns, social conservatives are fighting the culture war all by themselves at this point. And so there is a lot of disagreement. And there are a lot of people who say, Grover Norquist's conservatism is, leave us alone philosophy. There are a lot of people who say, you can believe what you want to believe, but government shouldn't be involved in it. Justin Amash, who is a libertarian-leaning conservative congressman, just tweeted minutes ago, real threat to traditional marriage and religious liberty is government, not gay couples who love each other and want to spend lives together. So there are a lot of conservatives who make that point. I do think that there are a couple of points, though, that this will lead to other things. I suspect that there is no way that religious liberty avoids being trampled. I suspect whether gay marriage is good or bad, a very likely result will be that that pastors who object will be forced to recognize or marry gay couples. That will be deemed
by law or by church practice.
Probably both, but maybe church practice first and then law second. But that sort of right of conscience will be deprived. I mean, I suspect that there'll be a lawsuit who says it's that look, if you want to get 501c3 tax status as a church, then you need to recognize all of our citizens are created equal and treated equally, and I don't care what you believe. You need, if you're going to marry anybody, you need to marry them. And it could be that speaking out against gay marriage becomes that there is a cost eventually to pay for that. And Bill, I know that that sometimes people who defend traditional marriage will throw out, red herrings in an irresponsible manner. I know Rick Santorum has been accused of doing that. I will attempt not to do that. But I will say that many of the best arguments for same-sex marriage could rightly be applied to polygamy. And I don't think this is a crazy or absurd notion. I mean, polygamy is a practice that was in the Bible. David, Solomon had many wives. Abraham. We've got in this country the Mormon Church up until whenever this was a practice of theirs. I think the Romneys left America and went to Mexico to be able to practice this. And I think that you could make an argument that why, if loving people want to commit themselves to each other, who are we to stop it?
No, I don't think that is I don't think that's the most absurd legal argument to make. It's actually a hard legal argument to square.
Unless I think you're right. Unless you say that one man, one woman. But I think once you open it up to anything other than that, then I don't know how you can stop somebody who wants to engage in a consensual adults who agree to polygamy. I don't know how you can stop them from doing that. That should be their right according to this logic. Now you could argue, polygamy traditionally has been bad for women. It's been bad for. You could make that argument, but I don't know how you can make it now.
Well, you can. I mean, I grant the point that it's not. I wouldn't put it quite in the category of red herring. I think it does raise some interesting legal questions, and you have to think through them. You can't just simply shrug it off and say it's a ridiculous comparison, because the question is, does the state have any right to determine the nature of your familial commitment? And I mean, there's ways you can delineate it when you're saying. We're saying that you can't discriminate against couples, and that's the line that you're drawing. If whoever you choose to be in a couple with is your business. If you want to argue, well, that's arbitrary. Why are you drawing the line there and not how many people you can have a relationship with? You then can go back to some science and say, look, it is scientifically proven that homosexuality is not a choice, that it is hardwired. And there's something hardwired about being a polygamist. So therefore, there's no inherent discrimination against who you are as a person.
I'm sure I can find something to buttress my case that I have a desire to be with more than one woman, and why not recognize that desire and make it all official? It's perfectly natural. It's perfectly natural for me to want to be with multiple partners, and why you can cheat, you can be promiscuous, or you can do that. You can have that right within the bounds of society, and have that relationship recognized and be official. It'd be safer, and all.
Well, the burden's going to be, to the extent that there is any sort of pro-polygamy movement out there, and I think there's sort of a nascent one. I'm not terribly. I don't have a great expectation that's going to grow. But in theory, if there was a pro-polygamy movement of any significance, they're going to have to make those cases. Right. They're going to have to show that, the image you have of polygamy as being inherently abusive and subjugating and creating children with who are disabled or whatever attacks that come upon it. It's up to them to disprove them and say, look, there's a way you can have a polygamous relationship that is perfectly civilized. And healthy,
it takes a village to raise it. I mean, it would be nice to have a built-in babysitter. I can tell you. I mean, it would be nice. I could have someone else cooking, someone doing the cleaning. It could be a very great patriarchal relationship. I mean, because I assume this is going to be men having more than one wife, although who knows, because nothing says that would have to be the case.
I mean, the fact of the matter is judicial cases are not simply, at the end of the day, legalistic arguments. There is an element of what is culturally accepted, socially approved. The Supreme Court are not completely walled off from the world. They keep their finger on the pulse of public opinion to some extent. And as it stands today, there is not a lot of evidence that there are a lot of healthy polygamous relationships out there. And therefore, they're not going to have a lot of luck in the courts. If that changes, if this is sort of big love style and you have sort of a nice front man, front women to put out to the world and say, you know what, we're not as crazy as you think we are, maybe that's going to change someday. I'm highly skeptical. Well, I see no great need for human rights to make it so.
Let me tell you,
in theory, if somebody did that, then maybe it would happen.
The thing that everyone sort of knows is that the big court cases aren't organic. I mean, and the big thing, I mean, Rosa Parks, as admirable as what she did is, it was done to get attention at the proof point. And it proved a good point, but she was chosen. Roe versus Wade, right? Norma McCorvey, I think that's her name, was chosen to be, involved in this case. And conservatives, I'm not necessarily an advocate of this style of hardball politics, but they should find somebody who wants to make this point out there and sue for it. And they should, while they're at it, they ought to have some 18-year-old guy who files for selective service demand that women also be eligible for the draft, or at least have to file for selective service. Because now that they're involved in combat operations, there's really no reason why they shouldn't be. I mean, I don't think that conservatives have really exploited the courts to try to push through their ideology to the extent that I think they could. So maybe some enterprising right-wing activist out there is watching, and we'll go to Utah and make this happen. Drop us a line. If you do that, drop us a line.
Let me shift gears to the piece that I wrote in the week this week. And I put forth the case about the grand bargain, which the posse of deficit hawks is still agitating for. You had the Senate pass a budget, you had the House pass a budget. First time they've both passed budgets in so-called regular order. In theory, they have to go to a conference committee to hash their differences, although the differences are so immense that it's not quite clear if that's actually going to happen, or if it does happen, if they'll just sort of spin their wheels. And Obama's been out there doing some informal discussion with Republicans, saying, look, I still want the grand bargain. I'm still happy to swap entitlement reform for tax reform if the tax reform gains net revenue. Otherwise, I can't sell entitlement reform to my party. And so I don't think it, to me, you might disagree, I don't think it's that debatable that Obama doesn't want a grand bargain on the merits. But he also made a comment to ABC that if it didn't happen, it wouldn't be a crisis. It'd just be a missed opportunity. So there's a sense, just to take Obama at his word, that he wants it, but he's not treating it as if it is absolutely essential for the survival of the republic,
which I find concerning, because it should be.
Well, let me finish.
Let me say it should be. I think it should be. I think he should consider it a priority. But then I'll shut up.
Well, this gets to the point of where my article was, which is there are folks like Alan Simpson who are sort of the face of the austerity movement, saying that Obama's legacy is on the line. It'll be a failed presidency if he doesn't do this. And other pundits have made similar comments. And it's even woven into a lot of his regular news stories that this is important for Obama's legacy. And the point I was making is, you look back at presidential legacies, and budget deals are never part of it. No, there's no president who we remember for the great balanced budget that he produced. That's just not what people get excited. One thing we get excited about, people get excited about things that last.
Right.
It's Eisenhower's highways, or Roosevelt's Social Security, or Teddy Roosevelt's national parks, or Johnson's Civil Rights Act. I mean, these are things that become foundational blocks of society that we still rely on today. And every great budget deal you can think of gets changed. It does. They don't. Budgets change. Taxes change. Reagan's tax reform happened in 1986. There have been 15,000 changes in tax law since it passed, and the tenets of it, low top tax rate of 28% and simplified tax code, that no one says is what we have right now. We have the most progressive tax code since Reagan came into office. Top tax rate's 40%, and no one calls the tax code simple. So these things just don't become legacies. And I think the last argument you could make is, well, forget, it's maybe it's not something people remember, but you'll be remembered if you are on the front edge of a disaster. Maybe people don't remember you when you address the hurricane ably, but people remember when you blow it. Or people remember when Calvin Coolidge didn't sat idly by while the Great Depression was brewing under his nose.
There you go again with your Calvin Coolidge attacks. You live in his hometown, man.
I know the right doesn't accept that narrative.
The man is a hero.
He's
an American hero.
There's still a general perception of Coolidge, whether you agree with the perception or not. It's that's the perception of his legacy.
No, I think it sticks to Hoover much more than Coolidge.
You could make the same argument, sure. But the point I made in the article is, look, when you look at the actual trustees' reports, the Social Security trustees' reports, they don't say this is going to explode in 2017.
Not Social Security, but I mean, the debt and entitlement reform. I think Social Security is the most solvent of the package of the and the rubric.
But even with, I mean, the deficit itself is on the way down.
The deficit's on the way down, not the debt. But.
Well, you're talking debt relative to the economy. I think you're still kind of around 80% now, I believe, which is higher than average, but not the highest ever. You haven't seen the negative byproducts, what could come from that, higher interest rates, higher inflation. That's not happening right now. They're both very, very low. And the Medicare Trust Fund the solvency date's been pushed back to 2024 because of Obamacare. But even those things, they're projections.
But I would just
they're
say,
not set in stone.
The debt itself is so high that I don't see how any serious person can be, insouciant about it and sort of brush that off. I mean, you.
Well, I'm not saying you have to brush it off. I mean, some people do make that argument. I'm not making that argument. I'm not saying it is a non-issue altogether. We're talking about the degree of urgency of the issue. Will Obama be seen as a failure because his issue is so urgent that is certainly going to collapse, in the next term, and he'll be blamed for the collapse because he was right there at the front edge of it? If that was the case, his legacy would be besmirched because of it, if it was that dire. But there's not a lot of evidence that it's that dire. It may be an issue that it's a problem that needs to be eventually solved, but could be solved gradually. Obama has done some things to whittle the debt down, to whittle the deficit down. It's not like he's been completely absent from the subject. And if the next 2 or 3 presidents whittle at it some more and you avert that giant collapse, no one's going to care that Obama wasn't the guy to solve it in one fell swoop. Now, if you don't believe that, I mean, if May Simpson doesn't believe that, but you don't believe that, then you could try to make the case. But I don't think there's a lot of hard evidence that there's this certainty of imminent collapse that's going to force Obama to make, bigger concessions than he would otherwise make because he knows that everything is going to fall apart. I mean, that's where I think that the austerity side is having a problem convincing Obama of the urgency because they don't have hard evidence to say that it's that urgent.
Well, we may disagree on some of this, but I think we can agree that everybody should read our columns at the Week.
Definitely agree on that. But doesn't this go both ways? I mean, if the conservatives really believed it was that dire, we are going to become Greece in 4 years unless something is done, why wouldn't they move off the dime? Why wouldn't they say, fine, we'll do the taxes. This is such a crisis. Everything's going to fall apart. I know this is not great for economic growth, but we just got to get past this point. Fine, we'll just do that, and we'll fight about tax levels later. Let's just get past the crisis first. They don't really say that. And I would suggest this because they don't really believe it's that time. They really
I agree with you in the sense that I don't think they believe that a collapse is imminent. I think that they believe that we are in grave danger of getting ourselves into a position, sort of like credit card debt, where you're just paying the interest and where, your grandchildren are inheriting less opportunity and more debt, and that it would have a dramatic impact on the future. But it's harder to quantify that, and so I think that's maybe part of your point, though. That from a political standpoint,
all this stuff is projections, and you look at what the Social Security trustees have said about when the trust fund would become depleted. And just to be clear about this, when the trust fund is depleted, it doesn't mean the entire program goes under. It just means that you're reliant on the payroll tax revenue of the moment. You don't have reserves to buttress that revenue stream, and that would probably mean an abrupt benefit cut. and the Social Security trustees have estimated that to be 25% benefit cut in 2033 under one set of assumptions for a projection. They actually have three different assumptions that have different projections, but the intermediate one is 2033. And what the Alan Simpson folks argue is, okay, let's not have an abrupt cut 20 years from now. Let's have gradual cuts that we phase in. It's still cuts, just structured in a different way. I mean, and you can make the argument that gradual cuts are easier to take than abrupt cuts, but they're not arguing a way to avoid cuts. And the other argument is, well, this is just a projection. You know, the trustees have another projection that the trust is going to insolvent at all because the growth rates are different, unemployment's different, mortality rates are different, birth rates are different. You know, we don't know these stuff to precision. And you look at the Reagan Social Security compromise, which sometimes gets cited by these folks. This is the example of glorious bipartisan compromise. The Greenspan Commission, Democrats, Republicans, they came together. You know, they did all the things that are being talked about now. They raised some taxes. They hit the wealthy a little bit. They changed the cost of living adjustment a little bit. It's an effective benefit cut. That was kind of gradual. They also built up the reserves to deal with the baby boom to some degree. There were some forethinking about that. And they avoided the crisis. But that crisis in 1883 was that the trust fund was going to hit a deficit, not be depleted, but to be in deficit within months. And that point right now is projected to be 8 years from now. So we got closer to this point before, and it was a little stressful, and people were a little hairy about things, but they still fixed it, and life went on. So there's time, and there's time to see whether these projections actually bear out or not. I don't see the strong argument that if Obama doesn't do this, he is sort of uniquely delinquent, and everything's going to fall apart.
All right. What am I going to say? Screw you, man. You want to talk about something a little more fun, a little light to end the show?
Well, you had a piece about one of my favorite shows, Parks and Recreation,
yes.
and a show that I don't really watch, Portlandia.
You should.
Not for any good reason, just haven't watched it. And these are shows that are beloved by, I think, liberals and conservatives alike.
Yeah, and I would argue, and I do argue at the Daily Caller, that these shows do a better job of poking fun at the left than anything conservatives produce.
Now, do you think that these are conservative shows, that they are designed to advance conservatism, or do you think this is just sort of an accidental byproduct?
No, I think that they're just trying to be funny, but they're not allowing their ideology to prevent them from making fun of people who deserve to be made fun of. Portlandia, which you can see on Netflix, is a classic example. They do there's a couple skits that I link to. You can find these at my site or on YouTube. One skit is this sort of hipster couple goes to this diner or restaurant, and they're so concerned about this the chicken that they order being locally grown and organic that they actually, before they will order it, they have to go visit the farm where it was raised, and they find out his name, the name of the chicken. So obviously it's poking fun at sort of that kind of hipster thing. I say as I look through my Chris Saliza glasses at you. And they also have this recurring skit that is a pretty good example. It's a portrayal of a feminist bookstore called Women and Women First. And in the bookstore, the dude, what's his name, Armisen? Fred Armisen, who I think plays Obama.
Used to. He finally got demoted.
He dresses in drag and plays a feminist, one of the feminist bookstore owners, and hijinks ensue. But what made me think of writing this was last week's episode of Parks and Recreation, where Leslie Knope, played by Amy Poehler, who's sort of a do-gooder, big government type city councilwoman, decides to bail out a local struggling video store run by Jason Schwartzman because of the cultural value that this bookstore brings to the community. And Ron Swanson, the libertarian, predictably opposes this bailout on libertarian grounds that this company should be allowed to fail if they're not serving the clientele. But the government, the local Pawnee government, ends up bailing out this company, this video store, which promptly turns into a porn store. So thereby, the city of Pawnee now owns a porn store. And Ron Swanson finds this utterly hilarious and laughs and laughs and laughs. And so libertarians and conservatives really like this, and they find it hilarious. And what I think is interesting, as I mentioned, though, Bill, is that here you have, Hollywood liberals doing a much better job. Now, granted, they've got a huge budget, but doing a much better job of poking fun at the extremeness of liberalism in a way that I think probably impacts the culture much more than anything folks on the right with their...
You don't think David Zucker's American Carol really did the trick?
If I knew who that was...
That was they had Kelsey Grammer and John Voight, and there was a whole big anti-Michael Moore spoof. I think it was in theaters for about 2 days.
I don't think it did the trick, Bill. More power to them. You don't always hit a home run. I think that... interestingly, I think we might have even talked about this years ago, but like movies like Knocked Up and Juno, arguably did more for to sort of advance a pro-life worldview amongst the masses than a million right to life marches would have done. So it is interesting how Holly Weird and the folks on the left coast sometimes make these conservative points, and I think Jack Donaghy was another good example sometimes as well.
Well, I think there's a long history of the Hollywood left being self-deprecating and poking fun at the excesses of the left. With the words, that's all in good fun, and it's not intended to suggest that this is some sort of definitive debunking of liberalism. And I think it's a healthy dynamic for every community or movement or whatever to always recognize that some elements of your team goes off half-cocked, and to be able to laugh at that is something that keeps you grounded. And I don't know if the right has sort of artistic institutions that are doing that for them. I do remember, actually, there was a great movie, Citizen Ruth, which is done by Alexander Payne, one of his first movies that was sort of a send-up of the entire abortion debate, and was pretty equal opportunity in its satire on both sides. And there was a story, I think it was in the Washington Post, that there were screenings of it to both the pro-choice groups and the pro-life groups, and that the pro-life groups were taking it more in stride and laughing at themselves more than the pro-choice groups were. So I feel like there's some appetite in the right to poke fun at themselves. I just don't see a lot of folks doing it right now. And I would think if there was more of that on the right might be better served. So that's one thought I had. The second thought that I had, I'm just sort of curious what the right feels about a character like Ron Swanson, who of course is making fun of libertarianism. He's not a glorified example of the wonders of libertarianism. I wonder if the right is embracing the character anyway, because I have an anecdote. I was once on vacation. I was actually in France, and I was sitting in a train station, and I was actually overhearing a conversation between two college students who were acquaintances, and one was clearly liberal, one was a conservative, and the conservative was talking of Stephen Colbert as being so hilarious, and the liberal was like, that guy's making fun of conservatism, right? He was like, oh, no, that's not it at all. That guy's a conservative. And the liberal was like, okay, buddy, whatever you believe, you believe that if you like.
Right. I think a couple things come to mind. One, Alex P. Keaton on Family Ties was an attempt by Hollywood to portray a conservative in a negative light, but I think Michael J. Fox is so compelling that he became inspirational to a generation of young conservatives, and I think it backfired. They wanted him to be Archie Bunker, but I don't think that worked. I do think that what's cool is that it's not funny when Hollywood portrays a conservative and the worst stereotypes. Racist, homophobic, whatever. Sort of like the dad on Footloose. That's so hackneyed, and I don't think it works. And it's so tired, and it's not funny. But I think it's cool that Ron Swanson, the libertarian portrayal of him. I think they make fun of him, but I think, whether they intend to or not, it's largely positive. He's often the voice of reason. It's Leslie Knope is often, she's seen as caring and wanting to do right, but often quixotic. And it's quite often the fact that Ron Swanson also has a big heart and also turns out to be on the right side of the issue, which was the case in this episode about the bailouts. And by the way, at the end, there was a porn video called "Too Big to Nail" that was for sale in the video store. I think a similar thing happens on 30 Rock, where Jack Donaghy is portrayed as sort of a Gordon Gekko type figure, but compared to Tina Fey, Liz Lemon, I think he's quite often the voice of reason. To her. And so maybe they intended to mock, Republicans with Alec Baldwin, who's certainly a liberal, and maybe they intended to mock libertarians with Ron Swanson, but if they did, I think it was a gross miscalculation. I mean, conservatives are so hungry for someone who's not evil to be voicing their point of view that they're really willing to embrace. And there's so many Ron Swanson memes and videos that are put out there by conservatives.
Well, I think in all the cases you raised, Ron Swanson, Alex B. Keaton, and Jack Donaghy, they both end up having bigger hearts than the initial portrayal would initially suggest. They're compassionate libertarians. There's a flip side of that is when they're going off, I think, on their right-wing benders, sometimes their liberal foils bring them back into reality, too. So I don't think that in any of these shows, that only the conservative character ends up being the voice of reason. That wealth gets spread around, and they end up sort of mocking, extremes on both sides.
I think that's fair. I think that's fair, and it may be, Bill, that I'm so used to conservatives being cast negatively that when they get equal treatment, it's seen as a huge victory. This may be like the abused wives syndrome or something. I'm just, so happy for the good times.
There are other examples out there, like Wedding Crashers, for example. The evil character are the disgusting environmentalists. Who don't care about anything but themselves, and the great Kirk Cameron debate movie. Listen to Me, of course. The Harvard debaters are also who are awful pro-choicers. So there are other examples where I think Hollywood has gone to. Right.
I will say this though, and I completely agree. And this is clearly off topic or a digression, but. This speaks to my argument that conservatives lost the culture war. Because in every example that we've cited, nearly, Wedding Crashers is a prime example. So you're arguing that it sort of makes a conservative case, but meanwhile you're watching a movie with all sorts of nudity and trust me, I know I've put it on slow motion a few times. And, I mean, the premise is that these guys crash weddings in order to sleep with beautiful women. And so that's obviously a very unconservative, in terms of a culture war paradigm thing. So even when conservatives have their voice heard in a movie, it's set in the context of something that's certainly not G-rated. So I think that speaks to how, the larger culture war has been lost, despite the fact that we can argue over tax cuts or something.
There's a sex sells subtext to almost all of Fox News.
True. I mean, Bill, I work for a site that has all sorts of Lindsay Lohan slideshows. Again, I know this because I look at them all the time, but the point is well made.
Right. I mean, I think anyone who knows human nature knows what's going to make people click or keep the TV on. And I think Fox News is sort of unique in that they try to play it both ways. They like showing you the clip and then wagging their finger.
Yes, it's horrible. These spring breakers. It is horrible that we're showing side boob. I can't believe it. But again, there it is. Run the B-roll.
I think side boob is a good note to leave the show on.
I've got 2 words for you. Side boob. Okay. No one said that, but it could have been a great Will Ferrell impersonation. Strategically. Okay. I think we had a good show.
I think we had
never in the course of human events, or at least of DMZ episodes, have we bridged such territories from the very serious talk of the Institute of Marriage to wedding crashers. In fact, Bill, I guess there's a common theme. It's all about marriage, and maybe we went full circle with this discussion.
That's right.
So it was all planned.
It's the DMZ.
We planned the whole thing out in our pre-taping and our pre-interview, and our producers did a hell of a job of bringing this one together, as always.
Applause to the entire staff.
The team that we've assembled, Tony Reale, with our fact-checking, producer Bob over here, the whole team, Mr. What's Rush Limbaugh's guy? What's his name? Mr. Snerdley. Mr. Snerdley, who's filling in. Everyone, a collective team effort. Bill and I, we get the credit. We get the glory, but it's you who slice this thing up, edit it, put in the hyperlinks, somehow publish it. I'm not sure how it happens. They get us out of bed. Wardrobe provided by Nordstrom. It's the whole package. You don't see the behind-the-scenes stuff that happens to make this so come together as it does.
Oh, good to talk to you,
man.
Matt.
Good show. See you next week.
Have a great week.